"You're just not the right fit for our label anymore." The words sliced through the room, chilling in their finality, as if they had been rehearsed countless times before. The executive's voice was a cold monotone, betraying no emotion, his gaze fixed on the paper in front of him, deliberately avoiding the artist's eyes. To him, the artist was nothing more than another name on a list, a line item to be erased with the stroke of a pen. The room, once a place of creative dreams and ambitions, now felt like a courtroom where the artist stood accused, judged, and dismissed without a second thought. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the decision, leaving the artist with the crushing realization that his talent, his passion, his very identity had been deemed irrelevant in a world that only saw value in what it could easily define and control. The office was immaculate, white walls adorned with gold records, sleek furniture that screamed success. But in that moment, it felt more like a courtroom where the artist stood trial, his years of hard work and talent dismissed in a single, careless sentence. The artist, a young black man whose music had been the pulse of his life, stood still, absorbing the blow. He had expected recognition, a chance to discuss his future projects, maybe even renegotiate his contract. But instead, he was being discarded, his value reduced to a number on a balance sheet that no longer added up. "What do you mean?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief. He had poured everything into his work, his soul, his experiences, his identity. The beats, the lyrics, the melodies, they were all extensions of himself. And now they were being taken from him, dismissed as though they were nothing more than a passing trend. The executive finally looked up, his expression hardening. "It's just business. We're looking to move in a different direction, something more mainstream. Your sound, well, it's just not what the market wants right now." The artist's heart sank. He had heard whispers about the label's shift in focus, rumors that they wanted to appeal to a broader, more commercial audience. But he had never imagined that he, with his growing fan base and critical acclaim, would be cast aside in favor of what was mainstream. He had seen it before, black artists being pigeonholed, their creativity stifled in favor of more marketable, more palatable acts. But he had believed, maybe foolishly, that his talent and hard work would protect him from that fate. "But my last single hit the charts. People are listening, they want more." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet defiance that refused to be silenced. The executive shrugged, as if the artist's success was a mere footnote in a larger narrative. "A flash in the pan. We need consistency, a sound that sells across all demographics. Your music, it's too niche. It's not going to take off globally." The artist bit back his retort, feeling the familiar sting of being told that his work, his expression of culture and life, was not universal enough. It was a subtle reminder that in the eyes of this industry, his identity was a limitation, not an asset. The executive leaned back in his chair, the conversation already over in his mind. "Look, you're free to pursue other opportunities. We'll release you from your contract, no strings attached. You'll find someone else, maybe a smaller label that can give you the attention you need." The artist stood there, the dismissal echoing in his ears. He was being let go, not because of a lack of talent or drive, but because of a decision rooted in prejudice and profit. He had been judged not by the quality of his music, but by the color of his skin and the perceived marketability of his identity. For a moment, anger flared within him, a fire fueled by the countless stories of other artists like him who had been cast aside for not fitting the mold. But then, as quickly as it came, the anger faded, replaced by something stronger: determination. He looked the executive in the eye, his voice steady. "You're making a mistake." The words were not a plea, but a statement of fact. "You're going to regret this." The executive simply smiled, a patronizing gesture that barely reached his eyes. "We'll see about that. Good luck out there." With that, the artist turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt like the final word on his career. As the artist walked out of the office, the weight of the executive's words still pressed heavily on his shoulders. The bustling city outside was a stark contrast to the sterile, dismissive environment he had just left. People hurried by, absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing within him. For a moment he stood still, letting the noise of the city wash over him. It was a strange mix of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a simmering determination. He wasn't the first to be underestimated, and he wouldn't be the last. But he was determined to be one of the few who would prove them wrong. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. His mentor, an old producer who had seen the highs and lows of the industry and had been a guiding light in the artist's early days. Without hesitation, he pressed the call button. "Hey, it's me," he said when the line connected. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension that his mentor immediately picked up on. "What happened?" came the response, direct and concerned. "They dropped me," the artist replied, the reality of the situation settling in as he spoke the words aloud. "They said I wasn't a good fit for their new direction." There was a pause on the other end, then a deep sigh. "I'm not surprised," the mentor said, his tone laced with the weary understanding of someone who had seen this happen too many times before. "But this isn't the end for you. You've got talent, and more importantly, you've got something to say. Don't let them take that away from you." "I won't," the artist said, the determination in his voice growing stronger. "I'm not going to let them define my worth. I've got something big lined up, something they'll regret not being a part of." "Good," the mentor replied, a note of approval in his voice. "But be careful. This industry, it's not always kind to those who go against the grain. You'll need to be smart about your next moves." "I know," the artist said, already planning his next steps. He wasn't going to let this setback derail him. In fact, he was going to use it as fuel for the fire. The global deal was just within reach, and he was determined to grasp it with both hands. After ending the call, he started walking, his mind racing with ideas. He needed to regroup, to connect with the right people who believed in his vision. There was no time to waste. Every moment was an opportunity to prove them wrong. As he walked through the city streets, his thoughts turned to the music that had always been his refuge. The beats, the rhythms, the lyrics. They were still there, waiting to be unleashed. He wasn't just going to survive this. He was going to thrive. The executive had made a mistake, but it wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about showing the world that his music mattered, that his voice couldn't be silenced by a short-sighted decision. And deep down, he knew that the best revenge wasn't in the form of anger or bitterness. It was success. He arrived at a small recording studio, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't much, but it was where he had started, and it felt like home. The familiar faces greeted him with smiles, unaware of the storm that had just passed through his life. But he wasn't going to dwell on that. There was work to be done. As he stepped into the studio, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was where the magic happened, where the noise of the outside world faded away, leaving only the music. And right now, that was all he needed. He sat down at the console, his fingers hovering over the keys. The executive's words still echoed in his mind, but they were fading, replaced by the rhythm of a new beat, the start of something powerful. This was his moment, his chance to turn the page and start a new chapter. The music began to flow, each note a declaration of resilience, each beat a promise of what was to come. He was down, but not out. And as the first notes filled the room, he knew without a doubt that this was just the beginning. The days following the meeting with the executive were a blur of activity for the artist. The initial shock of being dropped had worn off, replaced by a laser-focused determination to prove himself. He knew that his next steps were critical, and he wasn't going to waste any time. He spent long hours in the studio, pouring every ounce of emotion and energy into his music. The beats were harder, the lyrics sharper, reflecting the struggles and frustrations he had faced. But there was also hope in his work, a belief that his music could break through the barriers placed in front of him. It wasn't just about making music for the sake of it. It was about crafting something that would resonate on a global scale. He knew he had to think bigger, to push beyond the boundaries that had been set for him. The rejection from the label was a setback, but it was also a blessing in disguise. It had forced him to look inward, to refine his sound and his message. One evening, after a particularly grueling session in the studio, He sat back and listened to the track he had just finished. It was raw, powerful, and undeniably his. As the final notes played out, he felt a sense of satisfaction that he hadn't felt in a long time. This was the kind of music that could change the game, that could reach people far beyond the confines of any one label or market. But he knew that creating great music was only part of the battle. He needed to get it out there, to find the right platform that could take his work to the next level. The traditional routes were closed off to him, but that didn't mean he was out of options. He reached out to a few contacts in the industry, people who had always believed in his talent, even when others hadn't. There were producers, promoters, and fellow artists who had seen the potential in him from the start. They were all too familiar with the obstacles he was facing, having encountered similar challenges in their own careers. One of these contacts was a well-respected music producer who had made a name for himself by helping independent artists break into the mainstream. He was known for his ability to spot talent and his willingness to take risks on artists that others had overlooked. When the artist explained his situation, the producer didn't hesitate. "Come by the studio tomorrow," the producer said over the phone. "I've got something in the works that might be perfect for you." The artist agreed, feeling a surge of excitement. This could be the break he needed. The producer was known for his connections in the industry, both in the US and internationally. If anyone could help him get his music out to a wider audience, it was him. The next day, the artist arrived at the producer's studio, a spacious, state-of-the-art facility that was a far cry from the modest setup he had been working in. The producer greeted him warmly and wasted no time getting down to business. "I've been following your work for a while," the producer said, leading the artist into the control room. "You've got something special, something that the world needs to hear, and I think I know just how to make that happen." The artist listened intently as the producer laid out his plan. It was ambitious, involving a collaboration with several international artists and a strategic release that would target key markets around the world. The goal was to bypass the traditional gatekeepers in the industry and go straight to the fans, using digital platforms and social media to build a global audience. "This is going to be big," the producer said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "But it's going to take a lot of work, and we'll need to move fast. The industry is changing, and we need to be ahead of the curve." The artist nodded, feeling the weight of the opportunity in front of him. This was exactly what he had been hoping for, a chance to reach beyond the limitations that had been placed on him. But he also knew that it wasn't going to be easy. There were still plenty of challenges ahead, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Over the next few weeks, the artist threw himself into the project, working closely with the producer and the other collaborators. It was an intense, demanding process, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny, shaping his career on his terms. As the project progressed, word began to spread about what they were working on. Industry insiders started to take notice, intrigued by the artist's unique sound and the boldness of the approach. There were whispers of a major deal in the works, something that could catapult the artist to international stardom. But with the attention came new pressures. The artist found himself under scrutiny, his every move watched and analyzed by those who were eager to see if he could really pull this off. The stakes were higher than ever, and there was no room for mistakes. Despite the challenges, the artist remained focused. He knew that this was his shot, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The global deal was within reach, and he was determined to make it happen. But he also knew that success would require more than just talent. It would take resilience, strategy, and the support of those who believed in him. As the release date approached, the tension mounted. The artist could feel the anticipation building, both within himself and in the industry at large. This was more than just a new release. It was a statement, a declaration that he wasn't going to be confined by anyone's expectations. Finally, the day arrived. The artist and his team gathered in the studio, watching as the first tracks went live on streaming platforms around the world. It was a surreal moment, the culmination of weeks of hard work and relentless determination. As the numbers started to come in, it was clear that something special was happening. The tracks were gaining traction, not just in the US, but in markets as far-flung as Europe, Asia, and Africa. The global deal that had once seemed like a distant dream was now becoming a reality. But the artist knew that this was just the beginning. There were still more challenges ahead, more battles to be fought. The industry was watching, waiting to see if he could sustain the momentum and truly break through on a global scale. As he stood in the studio, surrounded by the people who had helped him get this far, the artist felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just making music anymore, he was making history. And no matter what came next, he was ready to face it head on. As the artist's tracks began to climb the charts, the world started to take notice. He was no longer just an independent artist fighting for recognition. He was on the verge of becoming a global sensation. The response to his music was overwhelming, with fans from all corners of the globe reaching out on social media, sharing his songs, and creating a buzz that couldn't be ignored. But with this newfound success came a new set of challenges. The artist quickly realized that breaking into the global market wasn't just about having great music. It was about navigating the complexities of an industry that was still deeply entrenched in its own ways of doing things. Despite the progress he was making, there were still barriers to overcome, and not everyone was happy to see him succeed. The first signs of trouble came in the form of thinly veiled critiques from industry insiders. Some questioned whether his success was sustainable, while others dismissed it as a fluke, a momentary blip in an otherwise predictable market. The artist knew these criticisms weren't just about his music. They were rooted in the same prejudices that had led to his being dropped by the record label in the first place. But instead of letting these doubts get to him, the artist used them as fuel. He had faced skepticism his entire life, and he knew that the only way to silence the doubters was to keep pushing forward, to keep proving them wrong. The global deal was within his grasp, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. As the weeks went by, the artist found himself juggling more responsibilities than ever before. There were interviews to give, performances to plan, and contracts to negotiate. Every decision felt crucial, and the pressure to make the right moves was immense. But through it all, he remained focused on his goal, to take his music to the world and make his mark on an industry that had tried to shut him out. One of the key figures in this next phase of his journey was a savvy entertainment lawyer who had a reputation for getting deals done. She was sharp, relentless, and had a deep understanding of the industry's inner workings. When the artist producer suggested bringing her on board, he didn't hesitate. "She's the best in the business," the producer had told him. "If anyone can help you navigate these waters, it's her." The lawyer wasted no time in getting to work. She reviewed every contract, scrutinized every offer, and made sure that the artist's interests were protected at every turn. She also helped him understand the complexities of international markets, advising him on how to position his brand and maximize his reach. But as the artist began to negotiate with major players in the industry, he encountered resistance. Some were reluctant to give him the kind of control and creative freedom he demanded. Others tried to impose terms that would have diluted his message, making his music more palatable to mainstream audiences, but stripping away the very qualities that had made it resonate in the first place. The artist was adamant that he wouldn't compromise. He had worked too hard and come too far to let anyone dictate his vision. But the pushback he received was a stark reminder of how much work still needed to be done to change the industry from within. One of the most challenging moments came when a major international label offered him a lucrative deal, but with strings attached. The label wanted to mold his image, to craft a persona that fit neatly into their marketing plans. They were willing to invest heavily in his career, but only if he agreed to their terms. For a moment, the artist considered the offer. The money and resources they were offering could take his career to new heights, giving him access to platforms and audiences he had only dreamed of. But then he thought back to the reasons he had started making music in the first place: to tell his story, to give voice to his experiences, and to create something that was authentically his. The decision wasn't easy, but in the end, he knew what he had to do. He turned down the offer, choosing instead to stay true to his vision, even if it meant taking a harder road. It was a risky move, but he believed in the power of his music and in the support of his growing fan base. Word of his decision spread quickly, and it wasn't long before it became a topic of discussion in the industry. Some praised his integrity, while others saw it as a foolish move that would limit his opportunities. But the artist didn't care. He knew that the only way to succeed on his terms was to stay true to himself, no matter what. As the global release of his album approached, the tension continued to build. The stakes were higher than ever, and the artist could feel the weight of expectations pressing down on him. But he also felt a deep sense of resolve. He had made it this far by trusting his instincts, and he wasn't about to stop now. The night before the release, the artist found himself alone in the studio, reflecting on everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about the executive who had dismissed him, the countless hours he had spent perfecting his craft, and the people who had believed in him even when others didn't. It had been a long, difficult journey, but now, standing on the brink of something extraordinary, he knew it had all been worth it. As he sat there, the silence of the studio enveloping him, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He knew that no matter what happened next, he had done everything he could to make this moment count. The music was out of his hands now. It was up to the world to decide what happened next. But deep down, he had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something even bigger. The global deal was more than just a career milestone. It was a chance to change the game, to open doors for other artists like him who had been told they didn't fit the mold. And he was ready to embrace that challenge, no matter what it took. The next morning, as the first streams and downloads started rolling in, the artist watched the numbers climb, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment he had been working toward for so long. The response was overwhelming, with fans and critics alike praising the album's boldness and authenticity. It was clear that he had struck a chord with audiences around the world. But even as the success started to pour in, the artist knew that this was just the beginning. The industry was still full of challenges, and there were still battles to be fought. But with each new milestone, he felt more confident in his ability to navigate this complex landscape and to carve out a space for himself on his terms. As the days passed and the album continued to gain momentum, the artist began to receive offers from around the world. Concert promoters, brand partnerships, and media outlets all wanted a piece of his success. But he was careful about the choices he made, always keeping in mind the lessons he had learned along the way. One of the most exciting developments was an invitation to perform at a major international music festival. It was an opportunity to showcase his music on a global stage, and the artist knew that this was his chance to solidify his place in the industry. The festival was known for its eclectic lineup, and his inclusion was a testament to the impact his music was having. As he prepared for the performance, the artist couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. There had been so many moments when it would have been easy to give up, to let the doubts and setbacks get the best of him. But he had kept going, driven by a belief in his music and in himself. The night of the festival arrived, and as the artist took the stage, he felt a surge of adrenaline. The crowd was massive, stretching as far as he could see, and the energy was electric. This was it, the culmination of everything he had worked for. As the first notes of his set filled the air, the crowd erupted in cheers. The artist poured everything into his performance, losing himself in the music and the moment. This was more than just a concert. It was a statement, a declaration that he was here to stay. By the time he finished his set, the crowd was on its feet, chanting his name. The artist stood there, soaking in the applause, feeling a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he had ever experienced. This was his moment, and he had earned it. But as he left the stage, he knew that there was still so much more to do. The global deal had opened doors, but it had also brought new challenges and responsibilities. The industry was changing, and he was determined to be at the forefront of that change. In the days that followed, the artist continued to build on his success, taking on new projects and collaborations that pushed the boundaries of his music even further. He was no longer just an artist. He was a trailblazer, leading the way for others who had been told they didn't belong. And as he looked to the future, he knew that the best was yet to come. The journey wasn't over. It was just getting started. Despite the artist's rising fame, the specter of racism and discrimination loomed large over his success. Even as his music resonated with fans around the world, there were those who couldn't see past the color of his skin. The more he succeeded, the more he felt the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, pushback from corners of the industry that weren't ready to embrace him as an equal. The first signs came in the form of media coverage. While many outlets praised his talent and the groundbreaking nature of his work, others couldn't resist framing his success in a way that minimized his accomplishments. Articles and reviews often focused more on his race than on his music, with headlines that subtly reinforced stereotypes or suggested that his achievements were somehow unexpected given his background. It wasn't just the media either. Within the industry, there were whispers that his success was a fluke, a product of hype rather than genuine talent. Some executives privately questioned whether he could maintain his momentum, citing his race as a potential barrier to long-term success. They used coded language, talking about marketability and audience appeal. But the message was clear. They didn't believe a black artist could truly break into the mainstream without compromising who he was. The artist was all too aware of these challenges. He had seen it happen to others before him. Black artists who had been celebrated when they first burst onto the scene, only to be pushed aside once their novelty wore off. He knew that the industry's embrace of diversity often went no deeper than surface-level tokenism. When it came to sustaining a career, the rules were different for someone like him. But instead of letting this deter him, the artist resolved to push even harder. He refused to let the narrow expectations of others define his success. If anything, the discrimination he faced only strengthened his resolve to prove that he belonged, that his talent was undeniable regardless of the color of his skin. One of the most jarring examples of the discrimination he faced came during a high-profile awards show. The artist had been nominated for several major categories, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation leading up to the event. Many believed that his music, which had dominated the charts and captivated audiences worldwide, was a shoo-in for multiple awards. But as the night unfolded, it became clear that something was amiss. Award after award went to other artists, many of whom were white, despite the fact that the artist's work had been more critically acclaimed and commercially successful. The final straw came when he lost the top honor of the night to an artist whose music was widely seen as derivative and far less impactful. The snub was glaring, and it didn't go unnoticed. Social media erupted with outrage as fans and fellow artists alike decried the blatant bias on display. The hashtag #JusticeForTheArtist began trending, with many pointing out the long history of black artists being overlooked by the industry's most prestigious institutions. But while the public outcry was loud, the industry itself remained largely silent. The artist received the usual platitudes: "You were robbed, keep your head up, next year will be your year." But there was no acknowledgement of the systemic issues that had led to the snub in the first place. For the artist, the experience was a stark reminder of how far he still had to go. His success hadn't shielded him from racism. It had only made the prejudice he faced more visible. But instead of letting it discourage him, he used the incident as motivation to continue fighting for his place in the industry. In the weeks that followed, the artist became more vocal about the discrimination he had experienced. He gave interviews where he spoke candidly about the challenges of being a black artist in a predominantly white industry, and he used his platform to call for greater equity and representation. His words resonated with many, but they also made him a target for those who preferred the status quo. Not everyone was comfortable with his newfound activism. Some industry insiders began to view him as a troublemaker, someone who was too political and too outspoken. There were whispers that his stance could hurt his career, that he should focus on his music and leave the social commentary to others. But the artist knew that he couldn't stay silent. He had a responsibility to speak out, not just for himself, but for all the other black artists who had been silenced or sidelined. He understood that his platform was a powerful tool, and he was determined to use it to effect change. As he continued to navigate the industry, the artist found allies in unexpected places. There were other artists, both black and white, who supported his message and were willing to stand with him in the fight against discrimination. Together, they began to build a coalition, using their collective influence to push for changes in how the industry operated. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when a group of artists and industry professionals, led by the artist, successfully lobbied for changes to the award show's voting process. They demanded greater transparency and diversity among the voters, arguing that the current system was inherently biased against artists of color. After months of pressure, the organization behind the awards finally agreed to implement reforms, marking a small but meaningful victory. But the artist knew that real change wouldn't come overnight. The fight against racism and discrimination was a long and difficult one, and there would be many more battles to fight. Still, he was encouraged by the progress they had made, and he was more determined than ever to continue pushing for a more inclusive industry. As he worked to effect change on a systemic level, the artist also made sure to stay connected to his roots. He collaborated with up-and-coming Black artists, offering them the mentorship and support that had been denied to him by the mainstream industry. He knew how important it was to create opportunities for the next generation, to ensure that they wouldn't face the same obstacles he had. One of these young artists was a talented singer who had been struggling to get her foot in the door. The artist saw a lot of himself in her, the same drive, the same passion, and the same frustration at being overlooked. He took her under his wing, helping her refine her sound and navigate the industry's pitfalls. Their collaboration produced a powerful track that spoke to the struggles of being a Black artist in a world that often didn't want to hear their voices. The song quickly gained traction, resonating with listeners who had experienced similar challenges. It became an anthem for those who had been marginalized, a reminder that they were not alone in their fight. The success of the track was a reminder to the artist of why he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't just about fame or fortune. It was about making a difference, about using his music to speak truth to power. And while the road ahead was still full of challenges, he knew that as long as he stayed true to his mission, he could help bring about the change that was so desperately needed. As the artist continued to rise, he became a symbol of resilience and resistance in the face of discrimination. His story was one of perseverance in the face of adversity, and it inspired countless others to keep fighting for their own dreams. He had been knocked down many times, but each time he got back up, stronger and more determined than before. And while there were still many battles to fight, the artist knew that he wasn't alone. He had built a community, a movement that was bigger than any one person. Together, they were challenging the status quo, pushing for a future where talent and creativity were valued above all else, where no one would be judged by the color of their skin. As he looked out at the world, the artist felt a sense of pride in how far he had come, but he also knew that the work was far from over. The fight against racism and discrimination was ongoing, and he was ready to continue leading the charge. Because at the end of the day, his success wasn't just about proving his doubters wrong, it was about making sure that no one else would have to face the same barriers he had. The global deal had given him a platform, but it was his dedication to justice and equality that would define his legacy. And as he prepared for the next phase of his career, the artist knew that the best way to honor that legacy was to keep fighting, to keep pushing for a better, more inclusive industry, and a better world. As the artist's career continued to soar, so did the intensity of the challenges he faced. While his music was gaining traction globally, the pushback he experienced became more pronounced, reflecting a deep-seated resistance to his presence in spaces traditionally dominated by white artists. The discrimination he faced was no longer just subtle, it was becoming more overt and harder to ignore. The first major incident occurred when the artist was invited to perform at an exclusive industry event, one that was known for showcasing the best and brightest talents in the music world. It was an opportunity that most artists would have jumped at, a chance to perform in front of influential executives, producers, and media figures who could elevate their careers even further. But from the moment he arrived, it was clear that he wasn't entirely welcome. The atmosphere was tense, with whispered conversations and sideways glances following him wherever he went. He could feel the judgment in the air, a sense that he didn't belong in this elite circle, despite his undeniable talent and success. The performance itself was a success. He delivered a powerful set that had the audience on their feet, unable to deny the impact of his music. But after he left the stage, the cold reality of the industry's biases set in. As he made his way through the crowd, he overheard snide comments, not so subtle critiques that weren't about his performance, but about who he was. He's talented, but let's be real, he's not the kind of artist who's going to have staying power. The industry has its trends, and he's just part of the latest one, one executive murmured to another, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that the artist was within earshot. It's a shame he feels the need to bring race into everything. Why can't he just focus on the music? Another person commented, dismissing the very real experiences of discrimination that the artist had been vocal about. The artist felt a familiar anger rising within him, but he also knew that confronting these people directly wouldn't change their minds. He had learned that racism in the industry often wore a mask of politeness, hiding behind professional courtesy and industry jargon. But the message was always the same: you don't belong here. Determined not to let their words shake him, the artist left the event early, his mind racing with thoughts of how to respond. He knew that his very presence in these spaces was a form of resistance, that by simply existing and succeeding, he was challenging the status quo. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. In the days that followed, the artist reached out to others who had faced similar struggles. He connected with a group of Black musicians, producers, and industry professionals who had long been pushing for change, fighting against the subtle and overt racism that pervaded the industry. Together, they began to strategize, to think about how they could use their collective power to make a difference. One of the first steps they took was to create a platform specifically for artists of color, a space where they could share their work, support each other, and build networks that didn't rely on the approval of the mainstream industry. They called it The Collective, and it quickly became a hub of creativity and activism. The Collective wasn't just about music, it was about empowerment. It offered workshops on navigating the industry, panels on the history of Black music and its influence on global culture, and resources for artists facing discrimination. The artist played a central role in its development, using his influence to bring attention to the platform and to draw in other artists who needed a community. But as the collective grew, so did the backlash. The same industry figures who had dismissed the artist now saw the collective as a threat. They accused the group of being divisive, of creating an us versus them mentality that they claimed was harmful to the industry. They ignored the fact that the industry had always been divided along lines of race, class, and access, and that the collective was merely providing a counterbalance. The artist knew that these criticisms were just another form of the racism and discrimination he had been fighting all along. The industry wasn't used to seeing Black artists organize, to seeing them take control of their own narratives and create their own opportunities. It made them uncomfortable because it threatened the power structures that had long kept them in control. But instead of backing down, the artist doubled down. He continued to use his platform to speak out against the discrimination he and others were facing, and he encouraged other artists to do the same. He also began to mentor younger artists within the collective, helping them navigate the same challenges he had faced and ensuring that they had the support they needed to succeed. One of the most powerful moments in this journey came when the collective organized its own award ceremony, one that recognized and celebrated artists of color who had been overlooked by the mainstream industry. The event was a huge success, drawing attention from media outlets around the world and forcing the industry to take notice. But the artist knew that the fight was far from over. The success of the collective and the award ceremony was just one step in a much larger battle against systemic racism in the industry. There were still countless barriers to break down, and he was determined to keep pushing until real change was achieved. As the artist continued to navigate his career, he found that the discrimination he faced wasn't limited to the music industry. It was a reflection of broader societal issues, of a world that still struggled to see Black excellence as something worthy of recognition and respect. He began to use his platform to address these issues more directly, speaking out on social media, in interviews, and through his music. He tackled topics like police brutality, economic inequality, and the ongoing fight for civil rights, using his art to shed light on the injustices that people of color faced every day. But with this increased activism came increased scrutiny. The artist found himself targeted by those who were uncomfortable with his message, who wanted to silence him or undermine his credibility. There were online attacks, smear campaigns, and even threats to his safety. It was clear that not everyone was ready to hear the truth he was speaking. Yet through it all, the artist remained steadfast. He had always known that success would come with challenges, especially for someone who was unapologetically Black in a world that often tried to erase or diminish black voices. But he also knew that his music had the power to bring about change, to inspire others to stand up and fight against the discrimination they faced. One of the defining moments of his career came when he released a powerful new album that addressed these issues head-on. The album, titled Resilience, was a raw, unfiltered look at his experiences with racism, both in the industry and in his personal life. It was a call to action, a rallying cry for those who had been marginalized and oppressed. Resilience was unlike anything the artist had released before. It was more than just an album. It was a statement of defiance, a declaration that he would not be silenced. The tracks were a mix of hard-hitting anthems and introspective ballads, each one telling a different story of struggle, resistance, and triumph. The album's release was met with widespread acclaim, with critics praising its honesty and its relevance to the current social climate. It resonated deeply with listeners, many of whom saw their own experiences reflected in the artist's words. Resilience quickly became a cultural touchstone, sparking conversations about race, justice, and the role of art in social change. But as the album's success grew, so did the backlash. There were those who accused the artist of being too political, who argued that he should stick to music and leave the activism to others. These critics failed to understand that for the artist, music and activism were inseparable, that his art was a reflection of his reality, and that reality was shaped by the racism and discrimination he faced every day. In response to these criticisms, the artist issued a powerful statement. "My music is my voice, and my voice is my power. I will not be silenced. I will not be told to stay in my lane, because my lane is wherever I choose to be, and I choose to speak truth to power." This statement resonated with many, and it solidified the artist's reputation as not just a musician, but a leader in the fight for racial justice. He had become a symbol of resilience and strength, a beacon of hope for those who were struggling against the same forces of oppression. As the artist looked ahead to the future, he knew that there were still many battles to fight, but he also knew that he wasn't fighting them alone. He had built a community, a movement that was growing stronger every day, and together they were making progress. Slowly but surely, they were changing the industry, changing the world. The artist's journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But he was ready for them, because he knew that as long as he stayed true to himself, as long as he continued to fight for justice and equality, there was nothing he couldn't achieve. And as he stood on the stage at the next collective award ceremony, looking out at the sea of faces who had come together to celebrate their shared successes, he felt a deep sense of pride. They were making history, rewriting the rules of an industry that had tried to shut them out, and they were doing it together. The fight against racism and discrimination was ongoing, but with each victory they were moving closer to a world where talent and creativity were valued above all else, where everyone had the opportunity to succeed, regardless of the color of their skin. And the artist knew that as long as he had a voice, he would continue to use it, to speak out, to inspire, and to lead. As the years passed, the artist's influence only continued to grow. What had started as a personal journey of resilience and defiance had blossomed into a movement that was reshaping the music industry and challenging the broader social landscape. The artist had become more than just a musician. He was a cultural icon, a symbol of what could be achieved when one refused to be silenced. But despite all his success, there was one person who had remained conspicuously silent, the white executive who had dropped him from the label all those years ago. The executive, once a powerful figure in the industry, had watched from the sidelines as the artist's career soared to heights that neither of them could have imagined. And now, in a twist of fate, their paths were about to cross again. It began with a phone call. The artist was in the middle of a studio session when his assistant knocked on the door, holding out a phone with a hesitant expression. "You might want to take this," she said quietly. "It's someone from your past." Curious, the artist took the phone, and the moment he heard the voice on the other end, memories came flooding back. "Hello, it's been a while," the voice said, trying to sound casual, but the nervousness was unmistakable. The artist recognized the voice immediately. It was the executive, the man who had once dismissed him as not the right fit, who had casually discarded him without a second thought. The artist's initial reaction was one of surprise, quickly followed by a wave of emotions he hadn't felt in years: anger, bitterness, but also a sense of vindication. "What do you want?" the artist asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge that the executive couldn't miss. There was a brief pause on the other end before the executive spoke again, this time more measured. "I've been following your career. It's impressive what you've accomplished. I think we might have some opportunities to work together again." The artist couldn't help but smile at the irony of the situation. Years ago, this man had been so sure that the artist's music wasn't marketable, that it wouldn't resonate on a global scale. And now, here he was, reaching out in the hopes of capitalizing on the very success he had once dismissed. "What kind of opportunities?" the artist asked, more out of curiosity than interest. "Well, I'm no longer with the label, but I've started my own venture. We're looking to expand, to bring in some fresh talent, and I thought of you," the executive explained, clearly trying to sound confident, but unable to hide the desperation in his voice. "I think we could do something big together, given your profile and my experience." The artist let the words hang in the air for a moment, contemplating how best to respond. This was a man who had once underestimated him, who had made it clear that he didn't believe in his potential. And now, after all this time, he was coming back, not out of genuine admiration or respect, but because he saw an opportunity to profit from the artist's success. "I appreciate the offer," the artist finally said, keeping his tone polite but firm, "but I have to decline. You see, I've found my own way, and it doesn't involve going back to where I was before." The executive stammered, trying to salvage the conversation. "I understand, but you have to admit, the industry is changing, and my new venture is all about embracing that change. We could do great things together." The artist shook his head, even though the executive couldn't see him. "The industry is changing," he agreed, "but it's changing because people like me refuse to let it stay the same. And part of that change is recognizing who truly supports you and who just wants to use you." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The executive, who had once held so much power over the artist's career, now found himself in the unfamiliar position of needing something from him and realizing that he had nothing to offer in return. "I wish you the best," the artist said finally, his voice carrying a note of finality. "But I've moved on, and so has the industry. It's time for you to do the same." With that, the artist ended the call, a sense of closure settling over him. He had always known that this moment might come, that one day the people who had underestimated him would realize their mistake. But now that it had actually happened, he felt something different than he had expected. Not triumph or gloating, but a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had won, not by proving the executive wrong in a single confrontation, but by staying true to himself and succeeding on his own terms. As he sat back down in the studio, the artist reflected on how far he had come. The rejection that had once felt like a devastating blow had instead become the catalyst for his greatest successes. He had taken that pain, that anger, and turned it into something powerful, something that had not only propelled his career, but had also paved the way for others. The executive's call was a reminder of the journey he had been on, of the obstacles he had overcome, and of the many battles still left to fight. But it was also a testament to his resilience, to the fact that no one, not even the most powerful gatekeepers in the industry, could hold him back. Later that evening, as the artist left the studio, he found himself reflecting on the broader impact of his work. He thought about the young artists he had mentored, the communities he had uplifted, and the systemic changes he had helped bring about. His success was no longer just about him. It was about all the people who had been told they didn't belong, who had been pushed aside because of the color of their skin. As he walked through the city streets, the lights reflecting off the glass buildings around him, the artist felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had stayed true to his vision, and in doing so, he had achieved something far greater than personal fame or fortune. He had made a lasting impact, one that would continue to resonate long after the charts and awards were forgotten. And as he looked out at the world, He knew that his journey was far from over. There were still new challenges to face, new voices to uplift, and new battles to be fought. But he was ready for them, because he understood now, more than ever, that his greatest power lay not in proving others wrong, but in proving himself right. The next morning, the headlines were ablaze with news of the artist's latest project, a collaboration with a group of international musicians that promised to push the boundaries of genre and culture. It was a project that epitomized everything the artist stood for: innovation, diversity, and the power of music to bring people together. As the artist prepared for yet another day of creating and inspiring, he couldn't help but think back to that moment in the executive's office, all those years ago. He remembered the way he had felt, the uncertainty, the hurt, and the resolve that had followed. And he realized that, in a way, he owed that executive a debt of gratitude, not for the rejection, but for the lesson it had taught him. The lesson that no matter what anyone else said or did, his worth was not for them to determine. His success, his impact, his legacy, those were his to define. And as the artist stepped into the future, he did so with the knowledge that he had already won the most important battle of all, the battle to be himself, to be seen, and to be heard. Phew, guys, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one, and make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We have many more stories of strength, courage, and justice coming your way. Stories that challenge the status quo and showcase the resilience of the human spirit. If this story resonated with you, remember, your identity is your strength and your journey is uniquely yours. No matter what obstacles you face, never let anyone else define your worth. Keep pushing forward, keep rising above, and continue striving to create the world you want to see. Each step you take, each battle you win, contributes to a greater legacy of empowerment and change. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us. We're honored to share these stories with you, and we can't wait to continue exploring the powerful narratives that inspire and uplift. Stay tuned, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next one.